I'm Andrew Schwartz, and you're listening to The Truth of the Matter, a podcast by CSIS where we break down the top policy issues of the day and talk with the people that can help us best understand what's really going on. To get to the truth of the matter about China's rare earth minerals and what it means for the United States in this trade war, we have with us Gracelin Baskaran, who is the director of our Critical Minerals Security Program at CSIS. Gracelin, welcome back. As always, it's great to have you.
Thank you for having me.
So this popped up pretty quick and it's all over the news now, but I want to ask you, can we back up before we get to the news about, our military, all these, car manufacturers, all the things that go into these rare earth minerals we get from China. First, I want to ask you, what are these rare earth minerals that we get from China, and why do we need them from China as opposed to developing them here?
Rare earth minerals are actually a group of 17 minerals, and they're a total misnomer because they're not actually rare. They're found everywhere, but they tend to be found in very small quantities. So what we're looking for are deposits in large quantities. And the big difficulty with them is that China actually has a pretty dominant hold. They produce about 60% of the world's rare earths. But our big critical vulnerability is that they process, on average, about 90% of the world's supply, meaning they source rare earths from everywhere. And it's really a problem now for our national security because these rare earths are in almost every form of defense technology, from warships and fighter jets to missiles, satellites, and our radar systems.
And so what impacts is this going to have on our auto industries, our aerospace manufacturers, semiconductor companies, and military contractors?
It's going to be pretty consequential. So the new restrictions, there's a range of restrictions. We generally start with something we call non-automatic licensing, which means that companies have to apply to get a permit to be able to export. Then you have bans and you have quotas, and then you go out, tariffs and quotas, and then you go out to an all-out ban. Now, what these restrictions are they are non-automatic licensing. So companies have to apply to be able to export rare earths now. However, these restrictions actually come hand in hand with a new list of firms that are on essentially a ban list from doing business with China. 15 of these firms are actually defense and aerospace companies, which means that even once the permits start being issued to export rare earths, they won't be able to go to some of these firms that manufacture really critical technologies.
So give me an example when it comes to the military, and then I want to talk about cars. What do we use what are the exact rare earth minerals we're talking about, and what do we use them for in our military technology?
So in particular, there are a few really critical rare earths. So dysprosium, neodymium, terbium are some of them. Now, when I look at our defense technology, an F-35 fighter jet contains 900 pounds of just rare earth elements. An Arleigh Burke class DDG-51 destroyer is 5,200 pounds, while a Virginia class submarine is about 9,200 pounds.
Well, this is especially important for CSIS because Arleigh Burke was our founder. So we need to keep that ship going.
We absolutely need to keep that ship going. And at a time when there is heightened geopolitical tension. Seth Jones put out a report last year when he noted that China is outpacing us in terms of developing and manufacturing weapons at a rate of 5 to 6x.
Right.
Now you add in the fact that the minerals I need to build those defense technologies are going to be very hard for our American defense companies to get their hands on. And you realize that our ability to respond to threats is deeply inhibited.
That's really interesting. And Seth Jones, the head of our defense and security program, did come out with that pretty groundbreaking report. Sounds like we're going to need an update now. But let's put the military stuff on pause for a second. Let's talk about cars in America and how cars are manufactured and why we need these minerals to keep our cars rolling off the assembly line.
So I'm from Detroit. I love our auto industry. And one of the things that I'm most worried about is that a lot of the minerals that we have been hit with export restrictions are actually in the cars. So rare earths form an incredibly powerful magnet. And that magnet is actually part of the motor that goes into an electric vehicle. So what happens for a lot of these companies, they don't actually have the same stockpiles. Sometimes defense companies, and in particular, we even have a mineral defense stockpile in the US, have some sort of buffer room. But the auto industry doesn't have that oftentimes. So what this means is when there's a disruption of supply, we generally would prioritize it to defense uses before it goes to civilian uses. So it could be a major disruptor of manufacturing, particularly electric vehicles. Last year was a record year for EV sales, but there's kind of the writing on the wall that we may have some really critical disruptions to being able to sustain that industry.
So what's the economic fallout if we can't, I mean, this seems absolutely catastrophic for the United States.
Really significant fallout because we don't have an alternate supplier. I was on the phone earlier with MP Materials, which is our US auto or rare earth company, and at the end of the day, they don't have the separation capabilities here at home. So what they are pulling out of the ground now is essentially getting stockpiled, but until I separate it, I can't use it, which means that because of that mid-tier disruption, every industry, whether it's semiconductors, cars, or defense technologies, stands vulnerable to disruption.
So I think Americans are going to need to learn a lot more about these things that we, I guess, took for granted. But I have to ask you, why is China choosing to stop the export of these items essentially across the board rather than target the United States directly?
That's a really good question. I mean, I think there's a few things that are happening here. Is right now they're issuing licenses, which means that we don't know who they're going to give those licenses to.
Right.
Right. So at the end of the day, it's possible that there's very few licenses given to the US, but countries that are willing to continue fostering stronger collaborations with China are not impacted by these restrictions. So it's likely going to be far more targeted given that it was in retaliation to President Trump's new tariffs.
So, Grayson, I want to ask you, let's go back to the military for a second. These rare earth metals are used in drones, robotics, spacecraft, missiles. Um, how do we, obviously, we have some stockpiles and we can keep going. But if this situation doesn't change, what happens to our military base when it comes to these really critical technologies that we're making use of?
Our domestic industrial base is going to be deeply affected. I mean, back in 2023, actually, there was a report put out by the China Select Committee specifically looking at, and there was part on rare earths, and it noted that we really needed to roll out all of the incentive possible to build the mine to market or mine to magnet supply chain for rare earths. And what we've seen again is that we haven't quite done it. But I want to walk you back one step. Somewhat people keep asking me, did we know this was coming? Rare
Right.
earths were actually the very first mineral that China weaponized in modern times. So back in 2010, China and Japan got into a fishing trawler dispute, right? And what did they do? They cut off exports to Japan of these rare earths. Now, fast forward to 2023 in December, China actually out a ban on exporting rare earth processing and separation technology. And like I told you, remember that they separate about 100% of the heavy rare earths now. Is it for a lot of Western countries, Australia, America, we actually realized we didn't even develop the technical know-how to be able to do this. So that meant we move much slower because we don't know how to do it. And then over the last 5 years, we've spent several $100 million through the Defense Production Act to build these capabilities. But like I always say, mining is a long-term industry. We can't bring these capabilities online overnight.
So why didn't we have these capabilities to begin with? It feels like, we knew something was coming, certainly with the Trump administration, and we had a preview of this in the first Trump administration, that there was going to be some kind of tariff showdown with China. I don't think anybody could have predicted it would be this much of a showdown. But why haven't we developed this capacity here in the United States and able to be self-reliant in this field?
This feels like such a common sense question to you, me, and probably many of our listeners of we've known restrictions are ramping up, they hold the supply chain. There's not really a great answer to that, is we actually just didn't do anything. Inaction was a course of action we charted for a long time. One of our American rare earth producers this morning said it was really going to take a national emergency before we really created a stronger strategy of what we need to do here. So even though we have issued some of these awards out in the last 5 years, we haven't taken the concerted action that we need. And now we're really feeling the consequences of that.
And do you see a scenario where the United States does need to develop its own capacity at an accelerated rate now?
I think that happened today. When I look at, there's two things that are happening in parallel here in the US now. When a colleague said I'm drinking from the fire hose, I think that was a very real statement. One is, how do we hurry up and build those processing capabilities, right? So we're currently building rare earth separation facilities in Texas, and in California. But how do we get these projects to speed? Well, they're still not going to be here tomorrow, but we're going to keep on keeping on with those. The second thing we're going to do is we're going to look for new sources of rare earths. The US government through the DFC actually has part ownership of a rare earths recovery project in South Africa. We're also looking to do debt or to a rare earths project that would have some of these heavy rare earths in Brazil called Serra Verde. And the idea or the hope is that for some of these projects, once those midstream facilities are online to process, that they would come back home. Ultimately, the success or failure of the US in this extremely critical supply chain is going to be dependent on whether we can line up that foreign policy to source feedstock with our domestic industrial strategy to bring it home to refine. And at this point, like, it's more emergent than ever before.
Gracelin, it's interesting. Just as we're talking about this, China's President Xi Jinping is traveling to Vietnam and Malaysia, which are two places that are rich in these rare earth deposits. Is that a coincidence?
You know, uh, Unlikely. Vietnam is the second biggest reserves in the world, right? And Vietnam is now going to be at a critical juncture of, do we want to work with the US and potentially be a source of rare earths to the US, or are we going to double down with our neighbor China, right? Malaysia has one of the only separation facilities in the world outside of China. And if they want to work together with China, that's going to further impede our ability to get us an alternate supply. So, given that those are two countries that are very strategic to the US and being able to find an alternate supply and, in a way, circumvent the consequence of some of these restrictions, probably not coincidental, Andrew.
Gracelin, the Trump administration has said repeatedly that the American people are going to have to accept a little bit of pain for long term gain. But it seems like this puts us into a lot of pain. Can you put that in perspective?
It's going to be a lot of pain, and it's going to be long-term pain. So here's what I mean by long-term pain is, as these policies and as these restrictions are coming out, most mining companies are finding new off-takers. They're not interested in the on and off restrictions, the on and off tariff, because ultimately they have shareholder returns that they owe, and they need the stability we're not able to give them. An easy example of this, earlier we talked about germanium, which goes into semiconductors. Our biggest source of germanium comes from a company called Teck, which is a Canadian company. They mine it in Alaska, it gets refined in Canada, and then it comes back. But with the tariffs, their CEO has gone public and said, I'm going to send it to Asia. With US tariffs, I'm not interested in the US market. So what that does is China is off the table because they've restricted us. Canada is now not going to be a source. And then what do we have left? Every device that we need a semiconductor for becomes more expensive in the long term, because I can't bring another germanium source online quickly. We are creating a long-term distrust in markets that finding off-takers to the US market beyond 6 months or a year is going to get very difficult.
Do you see congressional action coming to try to, sort of support the Trump administration, who's saying one of the big problems we have is we're so reliant on China for things like rare earth minerals, and we need to develop our own capacity. That's a big part of their strategy, it seems, their policy. Do you see support in Congress for this? Is that where this is going? Or is this a situation where the economy is going to really sort this out and people are going to be really upset if they can't get a car because they can't get a magnet for a car?
This is absolutely an area of bipartisan congressional support. I think back to probably a day or two after the election, and a Democratic senator called and he said, I think critical minerals are one of the only areas where we can co-write a bill now. And what we've seen actually is, even, preceding these tariffs that are obviously triggering a lot of these actions, is that Republicans and Democrats have released a number of really good bills on financing international cooperation, geological mapping, etc., to bolster supplies of these minerals. Because at the end of the day, one of the things I say often to countries worldwide is one country holding dominance at the level of 90 to 100% is not healthy for the global
And
economy.
that's where China is. They're 90 to 100% dominant in this space. We're out in the cold. And thus, this really threatens us, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And ultimately, it's in China's hands whether they choose to give export licenses out, right? And if
Yeah.
they don't, any country is beholden to that. So, a globally dispersed supply chain is a healthy one for the global economy. And so, there's a lot of bipartisan support to this. I do expect, one of the, was in the White House recently, and someone said, there's 50 critical minerals and five more that Trump has added through executive order. And he's, how do I prioritize what's important when I have 55 of them?
Well, that's a great question.
It's a great question. And I can tell you the ones where we are highly reliant on China, in the case of rare earths, graphite, a small number of these where you're in the over 90% range. The ones that are vital for national security are going to be at the top of the list. So, with the flurry of bipartisan legislation coming out, it is very likely that they are targeted at rare earths.
So, to bring this back home, another big issue with rare earths is, of course, semiconductors. We need semiconductors for everything from washing machines to computers to military technology. How does that factor into this?
Semiconductors are absolutely crucial. I mean, not as a matter of just defense or economic security. I mean, they are cross cutting in every way. And a lot of the export restrictions that have come out in the last 2 years are targeted at semiconductors, right? Germanium and gallium, very, very crucial. Gallium, we don't even produce in the United States, right? That was a targeted restriction at the United States. Rare earths, super important. Ultimately, I think, what's going to be really interesting to see is how the US prioritizes a limited supply of materials. So if you have X amount of rare earths, obviously, generally our military technologies will take first priority order in meeting supply. Then we're going to have things like semiconductors and energy. But given that rare earths are one of the few minerals that I use in everything, there's going to be fierce competition for limited supply.
So, this brings me back to the, US auto manufacturers. You're from Detroit. The big three are really important to our economy. They're really important to our national psychology. They're just really super important, especially since there's going to be big tariffs on cars from other countries now. We need American cars to be rolling out as efficiently as possible. What do you think this does to that?
The auto industry has been hurting for kind of in back-to-back punches from policy. The day that Liberation Day, Stellantis had already, I think announced it's 900 layoffs in the Midwest, which really hurts. Is when you add up the kind of current state of policy between tariffs and export restrictions, all these goods, reciprocal tariffs from other countries, making them more expensive to export. The auto industry is really hurting. And remember, EVs are already more expensive, right? I think about the fact that the average EV is $55,000 and you have a much smaller used car market. You think about the fact that your conventional gasoline vehicle is about 44,000. I don't know about you, but a lot of households in America are also very worried, right? The Inflation Reduction Act, which gave you that $7,500 tax credit for the EV, is paused. I'm not sure if I'm what the future job market is across the country. I've had many people say, I know so and so in manufacturing in Utah, they're worried about their job. So we have a supply and a demand crunch, right? Where the potential demand for these vehicles is really weakening as the economy starts to hit, gray skies. And then you have really critical supply side barriers as well, as it relates to these minerals. So the auto industry is really in a tight spot right now, and figuring out how to support them should be a bipartisan priority. I lived in Michigan in 2007, 2008 when the auto industry collapsed. And I can tell you that there were kids in high school that were as smart as me sitting in calculus who didn't get to go to college because one of their parents were ultimately employed or both in the auto manufacturing industry. I lived 5 minutes from a Ford plant, 5 minutes from a GM plant. Is this ultimately has generational consequences? And I see that for Michigan. So, these policies are really going to be tough for our auto industry.
Tough to swallow.
Yeah.
Gracelin, as always, so insightful on an issue that a lot of us don't know a lot about. Really, really appreciate your time today.
Thanks for having me.
If you enjoyed this podcast, check out our larger suite of CSIS podcasts. From Into Africa, The Asia Chessboard, China Power, AIDS 2020, The Trade Guys, Smart Women, Smart Power, and more. You can listen to them all on major streaming platforms like iTunes and Spotify. Visit csis.org/podcasts to see our full catalog